of learning and experimentation in China. Just to explain where I'm going to travel in this talk, I would just sketch in the outline of the talk I'm going to give. It comes very naturally, to me at least, thinking about it into six sections, none of them too long, I hope. The first I would call antecedents in China, thinking about warfare until about 1800, the long history before that time, some of the major premises in China about war and those who fought war. The second section I would call the first major blows to China, the first major attacks on China that began around 1800 and a little later went to the period of 1840s. That would be the second part of my analysis. And I call that the first major blows, domestic rebellion and foreigners. Because one thing I haven't really heard very much about yet is the way that civil war links with the war of aggression from other states, and often, very often in the Chinese context, comes together. They flow together, different kinds of combat, different kinds of loss. So that would be the second group. The third group I would call rapid weakening, and this is a very important time in China's modern history, in the 1850s and the 1860s. Indeed, China is disintegrating as Italy is beginning to integrate. And Chinese were very much involved, as I will try and mention briefly later. Chinese were involved in what they saw was happening in Italy in terms of unification and the Risorgimento. So the stories intersect in different times. But that rapid weakening period took us into the 1860s. The fourth block I would call the cultural face of war. And I don't want that to mean that I approve of war, but war does have a cultural face. It changes our way of thinking about the world, especially if we are sent into combat and survive, or if we have other jobs in the society in which the war is being fought. War has all kinds of pockets of understanding, pockets of operation, pockets of making money. We haven't talked so much about war and the finance. A lot of people get very rich in war, and China was no exception. So that would be a fourth group, the cultural face. The Chinese also call this a period of restoration, in which from the hammer blows of the first part of the century, China was able to reintegrate, or it seemed that it might be able to reintegrate and get a new life. The fifth of these sections I would call the force of change. This would be from about 1880 to about 1910, edging into the 20th century, what we now have to learn to call the last century as opposed to the present century. This force of change, you might say, dragged China into a different kind of world, brought it into a different set of relationships, and gave China a new set of priorities. It was a very formative time in Chinese culture. And the last would just be to draw some of these together into what I call a coda, just a form of a codification, in this sense, drawing the final thoughts together and suggesting how China's long 19th century, as we also call it, long period, ended in the year 1917 in my thinking. And China since 1917, which happens to coincide with the Bolshevik Revolution, but that was not dominant in China for several years. But nevertheless, that formative period is one that the Chinese are still, in senses, living through at this time. So that is our agenda, and let's see where we get. So the section one then on antecedents to 1800, the world in China before before 1800. One would be to realize or to remember that war can be a textual matter. War can be analytical. It can involve words before it involves killing. And it can involve negotiation before it demands invasion. These things have to be thought about in tandem, I think. And from about the 5th century BC, the 5th century of our previous era, China had a sophisticated set of texts on military thinking and military history and military strategy. Those texts were studied by military leaders and also by philosophers and by some in school and in other settings. And they gave us a look from a Chinese point of view at how war should be used. And what we find in those texts of around about 500 BC to about 200 BC was that in these early texts, Chinese talk about military strategy as a way of avoiding war and trying to pass off different enemies or make enemies work against each other to your advantage. War, in other words, could be an opportunity to channel other kinds of values into your own society. So this military strategy idea in China was very far from the heroic. We were listening to many different versions of war yesterday, but the heroic individual, the figure who stands triumphant on the field of battle, this is not a common typology in China. The good general in these early texts is one who wins the war without having to fight it. The early texts say that the fewer casualties we have, the better. And we must use the enemy against themselves. We must study their strategy. And if we study their strategy correctly, then we probably don't have to kill anyone. We might be able to overawe. We might be able to overcome people's thoughts about their own failures. And then this period of experimental thinking about the nature of warfare, the nature of sort of winning without overt battle experience, went into a very sophisticated study of deception. And again, I didn't hear this talk much about yesterday, but war is deception. And we often find this through spy mysteries and so on. But war is full of shadowy figures who live off the war. We see this now in current global conflicts right now. It's very hard to tell where the enemy is, and it's very hard to know how to use the resources of your culture to attack another culture or defend yourself against it. But so China believed in deception without any sort of negative correlation. Deception was a way, for instance, of making the enemy think you are winning, when in fact you are losing. You cover up your weaknesses. One of the most famous early Chinese texts discusses an enemy, a powerful enemy, approaching a Chinese city-state in the old structure of China, and is ready to give them a final blow, to kill their king, to destroy their society, and to take over their city. And as the new army approached the city to destroy it, they saw the leading general of the other armed forces sitting on the city wall playing the flute. He was playing the flute and relaxing on the wall in the sunshine. And the attacking army thought, wow, they must really be strong and happy and content in there. We're going to lose a lot of casualties. So it's probably not worth fighting them at all. But in fact, the group was a desperate group, and the image of them as carefree and playing the flute and relaxing was entirely deceptive. In their hearts, they were desperate. They could easily have been defeated, but instead the enemy retreated because they saw that the city would, or they believed the city would resist to the end and would probably win, because look how these people could relax. So a strategic alliances could spring from deception, and there was no mortification. There was nothing negative about pulling out of a combat situation if you could spare your own troops and your own forces. Early Chinese warfare is also dominated by ideas of military technology. Wars are remarkable times for technological breakthrough, alas, but they are. And in China, this was certainly true. China was a great bronze civilization in the early periods of 10th to 4th century BC. And these early wars in China, when they were fought, when people couldn't adjudicate them, were often chariot wars and with bronze swords. There were large standing armies in China. Casualties were, when they couldn't be tricked away, casualties were heavy. One other side that we heard some talk about yesterday involves prisoners of war. Not every country believes prisoners of war should be treated very well. And many of the early Chinese texts do carry very large numbers of people as having been killed after being captured. I just think that is one of the themes we should keep in mind. But so, when deception failed, sort of the killing began. And you can look at the different phases in that, if you're a military historian, through this very, very rich tradition. It was so cavalry and charioteering and bronze civilization, those are all expensive, and they're high technology for their period in time. And one of the first, I suppose, probably the first site to travel to China now for the global tourists would be to the great terracotta warriors in northwest China, where in this case thousands of men were buried alive, but they were pottery men. In other words, we can see these huge grave sites as ways of not having to bury people as you get more sophisticated and you bury models of people. It's a very different universe in that terracotta army. Very powerful to see hundreds of men in full uniform advancing on you, these life-size figures in China made in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. And now still as real as they must have been when they were buried with the deceased emperor all that time ago. In other areas, we can just see among the antecedents some things that just developed in ways that are very different from the European culture or other parts of the world. One of them was that China had a gunpowder culture, we might say. They knew all about gunpowder and explosives very early on, but they used gunpowder very little in warfare. So gunpowder was usually used in social settings, recreational settings, famous firecrackers and firework displays and so on. But China had advanced technology in bronze and other weaponry. It had gunpowder, but it didn't have particular interest in drawing the two together into artillery forces. And so if you look at gunpowder empires, as some scholars have, China is a very different one. In which different kinds of aspects of warfare focused on different things. Nor was China a naval expansive power, though it had the ability to be so. So they not only had gunpowder, but did not use it much in warfare. They had a strong shipping component, commercial world in China, but there's very little naval expansion in Chinese history. We don't see that much. The only period was just before the period of Columbus, which was the time of the 1420s to 1440s, when China did indeed expand its navy and do careful exploration in what we now would call Southeast Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa, if you can imagine the map in your head. Chinese boats of enormous size, holding 800 or more people, sailing with monsoon winds out of China's harbors, made about 6 large trips to these different parts of the world, from East Africa into the southern Chinese border. They learned a great deal. They learned that they could expand into this region if they wished. But they stopped the program of naval expansion, partly because it was too expensive, and partly because the Chinese did not see the benefit of these explorations. They had their own country. They had a lot of people, it was true, but it was a very large country. And the Chinese rulers' feeling was that if your people go overseas, they're more likely to be troublesome than if they stay at home. And so China pulled back about 50 years before the voyages of Columbus to concentrate more behind its land frontiers and leave the exploration of the sea to other people, or their own merchants in the case of fishing fleets or commercial trade. This world ended, and this would end our beginning of the talk here, it ended in the 1640s, when China's last, we might say, Chinese ethnic dynasty was destroyed by foreign powers, foreign from the Chinese point of view. Although later from the Western point of view, Chinese and Manchus was seen as being the same. But in fact, Manchus, Manzhou people, that is from what later was called Manchukuo, or Manchuria, it was cavalry-mounted Manchus, not interesting in those early techniques of not fighting, who swept into China and destroyed the last ethnic Chinese dynasty in the 17th century, just about the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, I guess, at the end of the 30 Years' War, as we would typologize that. But China then became what we might call a multi-ethnic empire. And there's still much discussion of this in China, and many of the tensions within China spring from different aspects of this multi-ethnic society. But from the 17th century onwards, at least for our period of discussion, we had Manchu conquerors, that is Manchu cavalry with their supporting family units and so on, coming in, sweeping into country of China with their own language, their own social organizations, their own religions, and then working with Chinese who wish to continue the previous government under new masters. And this, we might use a word, turns up in different areas globally, and we heard some discussion of it yesterday, but not very much to my surprise. That is collaboration and war. When do you assess the invader or the foreign power as being so strong that resistance is futile? And when do you jump beyond that to join their bureaucracy or their army, or encourage your children to do the same while you go into graceful retirement? But so China became partly Manchu government, partly Chinese ethnic, we might say ethnic Chinese, if you'll accept that term, a fairly strong component of Mongol peoples. And these three groups, Manchu, Chinese, and Mongol, coalesced into a kind of a unifying force for the country as a whole. Other sides might be even more surprising to us. There was considerable interest in Russia. China, of course, has a huge common frontier with Russia. And so there were actually Russians living in Beijing when other Europeans, Western Europeans, were not welcome. But there were some Russians in this mix. From the early 18th century, there were a lot of Muslims in the mix, because China expanded west into territory that was largely dominated by Muslim people. And so handling Islam became one of their problems in government, one of the markers of their expansion as well, was that though they'd given up sea power exploration into Southeast Asia, China had not so much given land expansion into the northwestern borders of its country. And that remains true to this day in geopolitical terms. And then China also was very much aware of its Uyghur population. We see some discussions of that now. And also discussed is something that began in the early 18th century China, which was garrisons being sent to Tibet to keep Tibet roughly in a Chinese kind of ethos of power and expansion. So that, maybe a little long-winded, I'm afraid, is sort of setting of the scene for our tragico Ottocento, the tragic developments in China brought by warfare. The first of these would be, I call the period of major blows, from 1800 to 1840s. And this was when China began to disintegrate because of internal factors, which then got complicated by joining in with Western expansion at the same time. China, as I mentioned, was unified under this complex system in the 1640s. By the 1800s, these military systems of multi-ethnic roots were beginning to weaken very seriously. China's population was also rising extremely rapidly, and Chinese rulers saw their expansion of population as a sign of the success of their society and their government. Happy people have large families. Peaceful countries are able to sustain large families. The government should be adaptable, and people, even from very, very poor backgrounds, should be allowed to study for examinations, and if they pass with honors, they should be invited to join the bureaucracy. We find elements of all of this in China. We also find, if we're even amateur demographers, the startling fact that just as this period begins, the period of major blows in 1800, the beginning of our Ottocento, China's population was over 350 million people in that, we might say, pre-modern society. And this was largely because of domestic peace and domestic prosperity. But it gave considerable thought to those now beginning to put pressure on China, that how could you occupy such a huge territory? And the solution taken by expansionist Western powers at this time, which in the 1800s were led by they were dominated by the Napoleonic Wars, but it was the time in which Britain, because of its Industrial Revolution and its navy, was entering a new stage of its history. And it was Britain that decided to open up China's trade, not to allow China that luxury of not trading anymore. Trade would come to China if China didn't go and get the trade. And so we began to get the birth of a complicated system of arrangements in China, reinforced by war when it was regarded as essential by the British powers, in which China was simply not allowed to stay isolated. And one of the first blows, as we might call them, to this period was the fact that as the fruit of the first war between Britain and China in the 1830s up to 1842, the goal, which might be rather startling to us now, the goal was merely, or only, to force the Chinese to open 5 cities on the seacoast to international trade. Just 5. And to let foreigners live there and to let them trade with the Chinese people. The government resisted this opening up, and though Britain went to war with China. It is not a graceful war, and it's not one based on moral premises. It's one based on tariff and trade and international profit. But it led to many, many kinds of changes, and I'll just mention a few of them. One would be the shifting in the whole coastal defense system. Because graduate students come up with wonderful ideas, some students have also begun studying things like lighthouses and surveying and naval technologies of various kinds that the Chinese began to learn at this time. It's a time of changes in ship design among the Chinese as they began to try and work out how to exploit their own internal riches, but to keep the British at bay if they possibly can. And the British were very soon joined by the French, and to some extent even by the Americans by about the 1840s. And they all shared in the profit that could be made in these 5 treaty ports. These ports were essentially rented out, sections were rented out to the foreigner, who still was not allowed to move at will across China as a whole. But the British were constantly backing up their expansionist technologies or procedures. And so as part of the occupation of the 5 treaty ports, Britain also took Hong Kong to be a more permanent, if you like, colonial base. So we have 5 cities opened by British firepower, and Hong Kong seized as to be a base for Western mercantile communities. We saw a rapid increase in knowledge of firepower because 15 years after the Napoleonic Wars were over, Britain was developing a very formidable arsenal of much more rapidly moving naval forces, and the first steamships were beginning to get made as well. And they could travel in very shallow waters. China has very few good natural harbors, and for those of you who like kind of geo-history, that's very important. There are almost no natural deep-water harbors. Hong Kong is the best one. So they took that. And it was also the period that, along with the Navy and the expansion, came missionaries on a large scale. The earlier missionaries had been Catholic and very often Italian or Spanish or Polish or French. Now they were much more Protestant religion of Christianity, and many sectarian groups within this, and they were dominated by British and American missionaries who expanded their own demands for settlement in the country with increasing energy. Well, that war ended in 1842. With the British essentially having got what they wanted. China was resisting, but in each of these cities they had to yield eventually to the pressures from the West. Now that led into a period I'd call my next period, 1850s to 1860s, a period of rapid weakening of the Chinese society. The great system of government that foreigners had actually also praised very much, Catholic missionaries, including Italian missionaries like Matteo Ricci, were deeply impressed by China's social organization. We mustn't think of it always in disintegration. They saw this as a powerful country. And the Protestants who came later saw the Catholic mission attempts there as essentially having been a failure because of squabbles within the church leadership itself. And that's a very interesting area of religious history, if you wish to study it. But now it became a more aggressive Protestant missionary forces who not only used these treaty port cities, but began to expand inland without permission if they were not given permission. And as has happened right up to the present day, governments were often pulled into these struggles and indeed even into warfare by the fact that their missionaries, their preachers, went ahead of the troops, ahead of the bureaucrats and administrators, demanded to build up their own parishes. Then something went wrong, like somebody being killed in a feud or something happening in a local village, and then the army is called in. So there's a constant sort of push and pull for military involvement in China itself. There were a new set of wars, a second set of wars in the 1850s and 1860s, again largely spearheaded by the British, with American allies and also French working with them. Another whole rule of new technologies arising, particularly the development of artillery in the West, and entire books have been and should be devoted to such technologies as that of the exploding shell, anti-personnel fragmenting shell designs that caused enormous casualties and were able to fire very long distances, far, far further than any of China's simpler military technology would allow. These new artillery powers gave different face to warfare in China, because China had largely been a city, a walled city structure of defense and governance. And these walled cities had survived really until the early 19th century, when modern artillery could force them to be blown apart. You could blow up the fortifications, and then you could kill the soldiers inside with anti-personnel fragmenting shells and so on. So it was a savage kind of warfare. The Chinese also countered with their own versions of siege warfare, which, like the other ones involving deception and bluff in the early texts, China continued to use such techniques in the 19th century to try and show that all was well. But it was very hard to sustain that kind of deception when your city was being destroyed from the outside by this new technology itself. In the 1850s, China also had its largest civil war, probably in its history, but it's a difficult balance of demography to know if more Chinese died of civil war in the 1850s or in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Either way, the figures are daunting, and we have great trouble, I think, holding on to them, trying to understand what they mean. But somewhere around 20 million people probably lost their lives in the great civil wars and anti-British wars of the 19th century, and about the same number lost their lives in the 1950s and 60s to the mass campaigns and the Cultural Revolution and the famines that went with it in China. But it was a bleak time. It was a bleak time with fighting bursting out all over the country and driving the Chinese themselves into a defensive position. Now this defensive position, I'd call it the cultural face of war, leads China to take a different series of defensive actions. I use the word restoration. They tried to restore the strength of the country and draw it together again. So it was partly a fiscal war, it was partly about tariffs, it was partly about foreign residents, it was partly about sea power, and a word that some of you may have been murmuring to yourself at the same time, it was also a war about opium, about narcotics, because the whole purpose of occupying the ports in China from the West had been to increase foreign trade. And China had shown a remarkable resilience to not wishing to buy foreign products. The British merchants and those fighting the wars from the army side and those coordinating the wars from the governmental side had not realized in advance that none of this would make any sense if the Chinese did not buy your manufactures. This was meant to be a new global system in the 19th century. And the Chinese themselves did not understand that it was part of the bargain that they buy the Western products of Manchester and Birmingham and the French industrial cities, and in America from Pittsburgh and Cleveland and so on. It was a new world that was not fully understood. But opium became added to the list of foreign goods to be sold in China, because Western merchants had discovered that it was only opium that sold on a really big enough scale to reverse the balance of payments, a negative structure that had developed with the foreigners paying cash for Chinese luxury goods and the Chinese buying nothing in return. Now the Chinese were willing to buy opium in return. It turned out to be a very good market, a large sedentary population, a lot of people without too much to do in the society, a lot of wealthy families with more money than they needed who were willing to spend this money on narcotics. And he went along with the expansion of Britain's empire in India, because the best opium poppies were growing in India, northern India, and also in Afghanistan, as they still are, and also with other centers in Turkey and Persia. But it became a global narcotics trade, and is, I think, one justly to be ashamed of from many points of view at the time. The Western technology had again made another series of leaps and bounds in this period, and the Chinese were now, just as they were getting used to the 1830s style combat, they were now having to face 1850s and 1860s style combat, in which the rifle and its accuracy and its range was completely transformed. A completely new generation of heavy artillery firing completely new kinds of shells were developed, what was called the Armstrong gun, which could fire well over a mile and cause incredible disaster to the troops at the other end. But at the same time, other harbors were opened up by the British demands and warfare, and some of these became part of a new China, or at least a restored China. And the most important for our purposes would be the growth of Shanghai. Shanghai, now one of the world's greatest cities and the center of China's commerce and industry, developed from a small market town into a major international metropolis, partly because of a whole complex series of financial and fiscal arrangements with British and other powers. And as Shanghai expanded, so did Chinese move into the city, the population grew, and the governmental learning between foreigners and Chinese also increased in that area. So Shanghai became more of a global open city, a very new kind of city. And it also became a center of learning from the wars that had been fought over the last 20 or 30 years. And I wouldn't have time to go into it now, but I would say that part of warfare, and this might come in discussions later on, or today or tomorrow, part of warfare is simply translation. There is an enormous amount of trying to learn about other countries and so on, of trying to construct new vocabulary. And so as part of Western expansion, we also get the development of dictionaries of Chinese into English, for instance, for the first time on a massive scale. We get the publication of scientific textbooks, not just to understand gunpowder, but to train Chinese to develop new kinds of industrial centers and development. It's a period of changing routes of communication, as war very often is, in this case by the development of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869. The Suez Canal speeds Mediterranean produce and also British troops and other European troops, French and German and others, through the Suez Canal into a much faster route to the Far East. It brings Egypt into international politics in a new post-Napoleonic way. It brings India into this same pattern of travel. There are major things happening here because of a speed of movement, of translation, the development of scientific knowledge, the development of foreign languages, also springing from warfare, and the need to understand the foreigner and what on earth it is they really want to do. And then, not really as an appendage, but developing out of this, movements towards women's education in China, and the development of schools, often missionary run, that will start giving advanced education to women is part of this same process. The last of the actual blocks, I would call forces of change, 1880 to 1910. And this is really a globalization period, a period of expansion, in which to the United Kingdom, or to the British expansion goals and the United States, which have been the true pioneers, if you like, the late 19th century saw an escalation involving really a bewildering mass of global powers. France got increasingly interested because of its expansion into Indochina, into Vietnam, and came into China from the south via Vietnam. Germany got interested because it was not yet a sea power, but in the period after Bismarck's unification of Germany, the idea of a German navy needing Far Eastern bases to match the French and the British, this became part of global politics. So the Germans seized much of Shandong province in the north. The British were already strong in Shanghai, but they added other bases to Hong Kong to solidify their position in the Far East. Russia expanded very aggressively at this time, and crucially at the end of the session, Japan began to enter world power as a key player in the international relations. At the same time, foreign experts began to come to China in increasingly large numbers, often teaching in Chinese technical schools and universities. Chinese students themselves went overseas, particularly to Japan. And in the late 1890s, Japan went to war with China, destroyed the Chinese armies, so we began to get a totally new element. One Asian country learning from Western military technology and then defeating another Western country to make their own new base in that area. And that is exactly what the Japanese did. The Japanese military expansion and its organizational expansion in the late 19th century was watched with great care and alarm in China itself and also by other foreign powers, though they didn't really understand the effectiveness of Japanese power until in the period of the early 20th century, 1904, 1905, in a war that really shook China to its foundations, Japan defeated Russia. Now, we might think that's a very abstract kind of thing to affect the Chinese people. But what it meant was that an Asian country, who had been very often despised by foreigners, now an Asian country was able to destroy a country as powerful as Tsarist Russia. And Chinese, as well as being dejected by the speed of Japanese power, were also excited by the speed of Japanese power and what was happening there. And they began to study in Japan. And I don't know if the theme of our conference is studying in the enemy's territory, as it were, but it's a very complicated system of when do you reject another country that's defeated you, or when do you send your students to study from that country on the ground and hopefully learn the techniques that will enable you to run your own country more skillfully. So we got a Chinese exodus to Japan, and we also began to get the beginning of major Chinese migrations, of which the largest rapidly became that to the United States, particularly in western states of America, but also a surprisingly large Chinese movement into South America or Latin America, and also a certain amount of Chinese migration, but much less, into Europe, Australia, and other territories. But there is a kind of globalization period to this, and so it seems suitable that we should end with a couple of other sides in which change and warfare went with new kinds of social factors. One of these would be, we heard discussed yesterday in a very moving paper, would be what we might call the spread of reportage about war. The way that war now becomes shared through new kinds of news outlets and new kinds of development. In China, one of the formative aspects of this late 19th century militarization and speed of change was again the telegraph. So we had the Suez Canal in terms of international trade, and then we had the telegraph in terms of international communication and education. And reportage, the act of reporting on the changes in your own country and overseas, expands rapidly in 19th century China because of the technology of the telegraph that enables many of the people of China, the huge population, which by this time has passed 400 million in the later 19th century, probably 450 million according to demographers. This speed now began to incorporate what we might call world history. The first war to be covered by Chinese reportage was the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia and France, leading to the German or Prussian victories in 1870. That was covered quite closely in China and analyzed by Chinese military thinkers and journalists. A second one was the Risorgimento, it was Italian history, which the Chinese began to consider as an example of successful solidification and unification from a country that had been fragmented into many, many units. As China began to feel the shocks coming from the foreign powers, so they also looked for these new kind of ways of purifying and strengthening the state. So Italy becomes part, theoretically as it were, part of this new agenda. And then the last factor I'd mention here is a difficult one, but it would be dressing for war. The whole idea of uniforms and how they are functional and how you borrow them from other societies. But certainly in China, this is a period in the very late 19th century when the absurdity of one's own appearance forced different kinds of changes. In the world of the Armstrong gun and the developing machine gun, to be like Manchus with the Chinese pigtail was just absurd. For a short time it was something needing reform, but then it became almost like an absurd symbol of your own culture. Chinese did wear pigtails, the men all, and you see them in the decorations and the paintings of the time and so on. But a pigtail goes very badly with a khaki uniform and a machine gun. You get changes in how you look, how you think, how you cut your hair, whether you grow a beard or a mustache, what is military bearing, and what kind of clothes do you develop. And for the women of China, who had another social factor that was inescapable for the previous 1,000 years, what was called binding the feet, the foot binding of Chinese women, which was a curious mixture of social custom and perhaps maybe some sexual elements, but also aspects of marriage policy. Many things went into foot binding. But one thing that did not go into foot binding was missionary schools, athletics, mass rallies, this kind of politicization. And as women became more politicized and more aware of foreign cultures, they got more and more hostile to the demands from their men folk and also their mothers that they must bind their feet. So the two symbols of the ancient China, the foot binding and the queue, the pigtail hanging of the Chinese, both of these succumbed, if you might call it that, to the internationalization of the period. And then, since this was a swing period, we began to get a small group within China who began to look at the possibilities of a new kind of non-imperial system in China. What might a constitutional China look like? Would it be like something out of Europe or something out of the United States? Or would it maybe more like something out of Japan? Should it be a parliamentary system? Who should have the vote? Should it be the women voting as well, or only men of property? How should we decide that? Should the traditional province be the base, or should it be different kinds of organizational systems in China itself? What happened, in fact, was a split, a violent split within the society, which not only overthrew the last dynasty in China, this famous one that had ruled since 1644, that dynasty was overthrown from within in the period of 1911 and 1912. And China embarked on a constitutional period of experimentation in 1912 that drew from these tragedies, from these wars, from these elements, from the linguistic changes, from the sartorial changes. It drew all these together into thinking about the constitution and having a major election. And China had a major election for democratic situation and for provincial-based local governments between 1912 and 1913. And things seemed very hopeful all that time ago, but the system collapsed. The democratic system did not take hold in China. And instead we got contrasting views springing, how could one be surprised, springing from many of these military aspects, drawing the culture now into new army officer corps, into new developmental structures, and into the new technology that drew China now into the world that was involved in the First World War. And though most of us don't know this, and I only discovered it quite a long time ago after being totally ignorant of it, the Chinese sent many, many non-combatants, but many Chinese nationals came to Europe during World War I. About 145,000 Chinese came to work in the trenches in France and Belgium and so on in Europe. And from this experience in Europe, and witnessing some of the effects and the development of World War I, China was ready, you might say, to be poised for a new kind of government. But the government never solidified in a strong way as a legacy of the 19th century. And so China entered the 20th century still very much fragmented, still very much an apprentice country with very immense social problems and a huge population. And that is the basis from which you got a new Chinese nationalism and a new Chinese communism. So the two were built into and out of that foundation of sorrow and war. Thank you.
Beh, ringraziamo il professor Spence per questa straordinariamente ricca relazione che per un verso ha aperto ai mondi altri rispetto a quello occidentale del rapporto con la guerra e per l'altro ci ha fatto vedere le connessioni fra guerra e aspetti della vita associata e vita civile più in generale. Oltre, terzo elemento importantissimo, queste onde lunghe dello sviluppo, questi elementi che rimangono nel corso del tempo. Quindi grazie ancora, professor Spence.
Funziona? Vi ricordiamo i prossimi appuntamenti. Alle 11 Sfuggire all'Apocalisse con Marcello Flores è alla Sala del Minor Consiglio. Alla Sala del Minor Consiglio. Alle 11:30 Reportage dai fronti con Massimo Loche, Ennio Remondino e Barbara Schiavulli all'Archivio Storico. Sfuggire all'Apocalisse alla Sala Minor Consiglio e Reportage dai fronti all'Archivio Storico. Sì, scusa, aspettavo di vedere se devo rifarlo.